Good afternoon, Catherine, Dr. D, and any other EDL507 classmates who may be viewing this lived curriculum snapshot number 2. When working with Macy, another classmate, on our podcast assignment, we each crafted 3 questions, and then we each answered our questions as well as our partner's questions, and that is what fueled the discussion for our podcast. And in thinking about what I wanted to speak about in our lived curriculum snapshot number 2, I really felt strongly about Chapter 32, the Common Core Standards by Neil Nodding, some of the statements that were posed and even questions posed in this chapter. I'd like to read straight from a question that I generated for the podcast. In Chapter 32, page 453, reference is made to structural and foundational or internal meaning in arithmetic, reflective of Common Core math standards, as contrasted to procedural computation, reflective of a more traditional instructional approach. And also from the text, the former approach has been viewed as making math too hard for many students, the approach that the Common Core takes, while the latter approach, the traditional procedural approach, has been viewed as a means to ensure accurate responses with low incidences of incorrectness. So the question I posed based on those statements within the text is as follows. In reference to the standards only, is the Common Core too rigorous, too compact, too abstract, or has society become too procedural by nature to appreciate the purpose, relevance, and potential transference of the standards within the Common Core framework? And I'd like to be a little more specific about when I say society in general. I know that in the workplaces, in the workforce, we are looking for individuals who are creative and can think in ways that are not traditional, so to speak, outside of the box, or as if there is no box. So I guess when I'm referring to society here, think back to our parents, our grandparents, even us in classrooms where we learned certain procedures for doing things and not really looking at it from a conceptual standpoint. So that's what I'm referring to when I say society. Have we just become too procedural by nature? I know as educators, and again in the workforce, certain businesses that are looking for that creative side or the problem-solving approach side, we may understand more readily the conceptual side of this argument. So when I answered the question for mine and Macy's podcast, this is what I stated. The standards delineated for individual grade levels and content areas within the Common Core framework may very well be viewed as too ambitious, possibly developmentally inappropriate, and quantitatively heavy in number of standards per strand, per grade level, per content area. Many of the standards may even seem too abstract and ambiguous in nature. And all of these perspectives are quite possibly, justifiably accurate. However, when looking at the standards individually and progressively across grade levels and content areas, and again, this is how I visualized it, a conceptual to abstract understanding can be visualized along a continuous spectrum of foundational development, knowledge, and understanding on one end of that spectrum, to more complex transference, application, analysis, and evaluation on the other end of that spectrum. For those of us who may have been students in classrooms characteristic of procedural learning, and I've shared with you before that that's basically how I perceive my elementary, middle school educational experience. In high school, I began to filter away, I guess, from the procedural in nature and go more toward the conceptual or the problem-solving Socratic seminar manner. So back to my answer, for those of us that did sit in those procedural classrooms, these Common Core standards may indeed seem too rigorous, too compact, and too abstract. However, for those of us who have recognized the significance of conceptual understanding as a precursor for successful procedural knowledge, understanding, and application, and more importantly, critical analysis in a problem-solving, seeking work society, the rigor within the Common Core framework is not only relevant, but necessary. Just the other day, I was in a classroom doing an observation in a framework called an instructional rounds, where one teacher hosts a lesson for other observers, and the teacher in a pre-rounds conference tells the observers what it is she is looking for either in her practice or what her students are doing so that she can improve upon what's going on through warm and cool feedback that the observers give. So I was an observer. The teacher that was hosting had a small group of students at the back table, and they were comparing fractions using what I called, when I was going through school, cross multiplication, which is procedural. In her classroom, she called it the butterfly method, and the children were using what I'm going to call cross multiplication to compare fractions by diagonally multiplying, recording the number at the top of each computation direction, and the one that had the highest product, because you're multiplying, that was the fraction that was the greatest. The one that had the lowest product diagonally was your fraction that was the least. So a student was comparing 1/3 and 1/2 and used the butterfly method or cross multiplication method to compare the fractions. And I just was having conversation with all of the children, and I asked that child to think about it without using cross multiplication or the butterfly method. I moved that away, the little whiteboard that the student was writing on, and I said, so if you had 1/3 of a pie and then you had 1/2 of a pie, in which one would you get the largest piece of the pie? And the student did not have conceptual knowledge to readily explain or even process that. The child had become so fixated on doing the procedural method and had it accurate, the answer was correct, that he was unable to process 2 pieces versus 3 pieces of the same size. 2 would be larger than 3, so if you got 1/2, you would get more than you would in 1/3. He just couldn't think that way, and so you could automatically tell that he had not been taught that way. And for me, I see the relevance of being able to reason through and use logic when comparing fractions of that nature rather than just going to the procedural method. I want the conceptual to take place, and then I want the procedural to take place to check to make sure that your conceptual knowledge is correct. So that is what I have for our lived curriculum snapshot number 2. I look forward to looking at yours, Catherine, and hearing feedback. Thank you.